You're back. Thank you. This is the second episode of the lesson on the practice of leadership. And the objective here is to continue where we left off in the first episode, where I spoke to you about the evolution of leadership theory over time. And we spoke about the nature of the leadership theories that we enjoyed in the 1800s, the great man theories, and then in the 1900s. And I ended up in the first episode talking or introducing you to the notion of there being a situational leadership theory. That's where we get to today in this lesson, because again, I'm going to retreat to the corner of the screen and point out to you that this is where we left off. I introduced situational leadership to you, and that's what we're going to illustrate right now. When Hersey and Blanchard introduced this, they presented it to the academic world first of all, but it was then reduced to something called the 1-minute manager. I recommend that you might want to pick up an online PDF copy of the 1-minute manager, because while it can be considered to be a little simplistic, it's actually a very, very nice, simple and straightforward read. And I have an online copy, and it's very easy to obtain. I recommend you get one too. So this is their theory. There's several complicated parts over here, which is why I left the detail of this for the second episode of this lesson. Hersey and Blanchard spoke about our followers, if we are a leader, as having a readiness. And the readiness is something which is a gradient from very ready, willing, and able to get something done, moderate, and low. In other words, just not in the ballpark. Someone is just not ready to take on the responsibilities of getting the job done for the leader. So, big emphasis on the quality of the followers, the subordinates. In addition to which, they said there's a leadership style. Now, before you get worried about the complexity of this, just look over here. We're saying that the leadership style is something which is going to be task-focused, nothing different there from the prior theories, or relationship-focused. So this is just like Blake and Maton and the theories, the contingency theories which followed. We're saying that you can have a low task orientation and a high task orientation. In other words, Blake and Maton would say this is 1 and this is 9. Or you can have a Blake and Maton 1 over here and a Blake and Maton 9 over there. Point is that there's an increase and an increase in those two dimensions. Now, what you see here is an S1, S2, S3, and S4 alternative for the practice of a leadership style. Now, let's try and map the top half of this illustration here to the bottom half of the illustration here. And I'm going to draw a series of arrows on this illustration for you. There's the first one. What we're saying is that if someone has a very low level of readiness, in other words, they are unable and they're unwilling for whatever reason. Just contemplate this. When you start your first job one day, you are not going to know how to get the job done, and you're going to be afraid of making mistakes. In other words, you can't be left to your own devices. Consequently, the leader should tell you what to do. So what Hersey and Blanchard were saying is that when you get your first job, your boss needs to have a very high task focus and doesn't have to worry about preserving the relationship. Basically, your boss knows that you're there for the money and for the experience. They can just tell you what to do. By the time you've spent 6 months in internship, do you recognize that you are more confident than what you used to be, but you don't necessarily have after only 6 months? a greater level of ability. So they said this is a readiness level of R2. And the R2 level says that you're a lot more confident in what you do, but it doesn't mean you're an expert. And if we draw this arrow into the diagram, the suggestion then, they point out, is that you are going to be task-oriented as well as relationship-oriented. Simply, they said, you need to sell this to your followers. It's a nice theory. I'm beginning to like this quite a lot. Actually, the truth is I've always liked it. I think it's a great one. Now, in terms of this readiness dimension and trajectory, an R3 readiness means that you're able to get things done, but you might have a little bit of a loss in motivation, because while after a year or two of working, you will have a lot of ability, you'll be scared about making mistakes because you're now you're part and parcel of the furniture in that business. They like you, you like them, and you don't want to disappoint them. It means that with a level of motivation, if you like, or self-confidence, which is low, even though you don't even realize how good you've become, if we draw the arrow in now, Hershey and Blanchard was saying it is necessary to demonstrate a high relationships focus. That's to cater for your lack of confidence and not emphasize the task. Do you know why? Because you know how to do the job. Remember, you're able. You're able, but you're feeling unconfident. If that's the case, the best thing to do is to have a low task focus and a high relationships focus if you're going to lead that person well. Finally, if you're able to do the job and you're willing to do the job, you know what you're doing, why do we have to fuss and bother? Surely the best thing they say is just not to get on your case. Don't worry about having to be nice to you, and don't worry about getting the job done. Just say, do the job, because you are willing and able. Now, as I say, a great theory, and I really do recommend, maybe not if you're heading up to assessment, but during holidays, the break, the vacation, why not get a copy of the 1 Minute Manager and familiarize yourself with this, because it really is a good read. Worthwhile being familiar with this. It really is worthwhile being familiar with this. Then let me share that screen with you again. We get to another class of leadership theory, and that is the so-called reciprocal theories. The reciprocal theories, remember from our timeline in the first episode, are like funky and modern and with it and hip and woke. They make the presumption that leadership is about relations, but also that it is a shared process with an emphasis on followership. And this is the key thing here. We identify a couple of different leadership models or theories in this reciprocity class. So-called leadership substitutes model, and servant leadership, and charismatic leadership, and transformational leadership. What these theories are about is, in the leadership substitute model, and what you read on the screen there is not necessarily comprehensible. I'll try and read it to you for optimization of the meaning of the sentence. A characteristic of a subordinate, or the characteristic of a situation or context, can act in place of the influence of a leader. In other words, a shrewd, smart leader is going to say, hey, do I actually need to lead over here, or can I rely on the characteristics of the subordinate, or just the nature of the situation? Very, very close relationship you can see with the Hersian Blanchard theory, maybe it's not necessary to actually lead. It's a little bit like the fourth quadrant of the Hersian Blanchard model. The alternatives over here, we're saying if it's about employee characteristics, well, again, someone who's very willing and very able, who has a high readiness level, the R4 level in the Hersian Blanchard theory, lots of experience, lots of training, professional orientation, someone who's not worried about the pay per se. And if the job structure then is unambiguous and routine and satisfying to perform, then why make a fuss? Just let the person get on with it. If we add to that the fact that the organization might have an influence, particularly where the rules of what to do are very clear, and people get along with each other, then if those characteristics are all in place, why would we make a fuss about leading? Surely we can just let people get on with the job. And similarly, if people aren't really able, in other words, in Hersian Blanchard, they have an R1 level. And if the job is a difficult task, the task structure is something where it's unclear and where the organization is not necessarily supportive, then clearly you can't rely on people getting on with the job themselves. You have to be more active. Okay. What we're saying, that where the manager needs to get on with a job that they need to do, where their particular expertise is required, then maybe the manager can then look at those three categories, if you like, and say, can I actually abandon the task to my followers, my subordinates? Can I just let them get on with it? Do I really need to be involved? Or do the organizational characteristics and the employee characteristics and the nature of the job that needs to be undertaken all make it clear to me that I can actually step back and just let it happen? So that's the leader substitutes model. I don't know that it necessarily gives us very much on top of what Hersey and Blanchard were able to show us way back in the 1990s. So I'm not a fan. I'm not necessarily a fan of charismatic leadership either. You see, what we're saying is that a charismatic leader is someone who can see beyond the usual. And they're able just to see this great future that becomes possible. That could require big changes in the culture of an organization, the nature of decision making in an organization. And what Max Weber was saying is that if the situation requires it, if it is a situation which requires great change, then the charismatic leader is followed because their psychosocial influence, their relationships orientation, and their powerful personality is such that people will follow simply because that person represents the kind of ideal role model. And it's a little bit like the great man theories. There's a problem with that, though. Several problems. And the problem is, even if you are able to win influence over people by providing them with an identity, a role model, there's two things in particular. If things are going to get better, dramatically better, it might not be sustainable, simply because you can't expect people just to be more and more enthusiastic day after day, week after week, year after year. Some way or other, they're going to hit a threshold where their ability to be enthusiastic basically hits the end of their rope. And excuse me, charismatic leaders can start to demonstrate a hubris. Look it up if you're unfamiliar with the word, a hubris or egoism, where they become so enamored with their own success and their own charisma that it gives rise to a bit of cultishness, and that's a dilemma which impacts very, very badly on the long-term well-being of both the organization as well as the followers. That's not all. One of the other criticisms raised over here is that there's not much substance to charismatic leadership, and cults are criticized for there being style and no substance. That is a dilemma which is not an insignificant one. If you want to clip this particular page, it might be ideal to do it now that I've put the being beyond reproach explanation on screen. Another common problem for charismatic leaders is that followers aren't willing to question their decisions, often because there is social pressure to accept the leader's views. In other words, this great man persona that the charismatic leaders manifest is something which means that there becomes an in crowd and an out crowd. And the in group says, just do what the leader says. Because if you don't do what the leader says, then we're going to push you into the out group, and you will not be one of us. You will be one of the others, and you will demonstrate too much otherness, and will slowly squeeze you out of the organization. Long term, that's not good for the organization, and it's not good for the people. So charismatic leadership, I think, is something which can be debunked. There has to be something more solid than that. Similarly, there is this notion of there being transformational leadership, and transformational leadership is in fact best explained by contrasting transformational leadership with transactional leadership. Transformational leadership sounds very, very good. It makes subordinates aware of the importance of their jobs, says bullet 2. Makes them aware of their own needs for personal growth and development, says bullet 3. And bullet 4 says that it motivates workers to work for the good of the organization and not just themselves. Sounds wonderful. If one is able to achieve this, but just the concern, and this is where we can contrast very effectively transactional leadership with transformational leadership. Transactional leaders treat the interactions as transactions. They clarify roles, they clarify the task requirements, and they set their subordinates or their followers in motion in order to achieve those. Whereas transformational leaders inspire people, inspire them to transcend their own self-interests for the good of the organization. It sounds very, very good for the organization. And where this does happen, it can be quite profound. But much like the charismatic leadership, there's a question of hubris and this feedback loop where the transformational leader effectively then is running a cult as opposed to a department. And that is a concern. I recommend you look at this next slide that I put on the screen in front of you, and that you make a note of this, because this is a fairly fundamental one. What we're saying is there are, and this is reproduced in your text and you can find it online. It's a good one to have. So make a note of these things, please. But let me continue this. Problem with transformational leadership is that this transformation is a bit airy-fairy. There's just a lack of focus. It's a bit of a problem. And there's the potential for burnout. People can just be overworked. They can be driven to perform because they're so motivated, much like the motivation which the cultish charismatic leaders achieve, but it's not sustainable. It disrupts routines, and it doesn't provide for checks and balances, and consequently there's a problem with that. It relies on the individual personalities, and it does, and I think this is a crucial one, it tends to exaggerate disagreements. In any organization, one can expect that there are going to be people who have a point of view which differs from others. In a transformational or charismatic setup, what we're doing by creating an in-group and an out-group, with the in-group following the leader and the out-group being those who question the leader, the disagreements or the contradictions in perspective get massively exaggerated. And what that does do is freeze out the non-believers, if you like, or the non-followers. It's calamitous. And I have to tell you that it is exactly like this in practice. It's the most unfortunate thing because it doesn't actually extract the full benefit of the contribution that followers can make, simply because it is drawing them in, if you like, on the basis of believing in the leader, as opposed to getting the job done in the best possible way. So I think it's time just to reflect on this as we come to the end of your leadership episodes. This is what you've learned. We want managers to lead. After all, we defined this in the early 1900s as plocking, planning, leading, organizing, and controlling. That's what leadership, scientific leadership, is about. But what we know is that there is no guarantee that a manager is in fact going to be an effective leader. We know that leadership is about social influence, and it is also about positional power. And the power is what a leader uses to overcome resistance, especially where the job isn't a nice thing to do or isn't a clear-cut thing to do. The power that someone actually has in their job as a manager leader then is something which is going to depend on them as a person, as well as the rank they have in the organization with regard to the positional power which they are able to wield. We also know that you can model leadership activity. We do this as the simple elementary trait theories, and then as the more complex behavioral and contingency and situational models. And then finally, we observe over the last 20, 30, 40 years or so, the emergence of the charismatic theories. The calamity with the charismatic theories is that there appears to be an overly simplistic return, if you like, to the great man theories of the 1800s, which simply embrace unquestioningly the anticipated expertise of the leader on the basis of their great psychosocial, psycho-emotional influence over their followers. And that isn't necessarily good for business. Now, a lot to cover, a lot to understand, and I think leading is potentially the most complex, the most elaborate, the most difficult component of any program of understanding in the principles of management. It's why we leave it to the end of this particular module. But you have to see it in the context of everything we do. And I'll leave it at that point. And I hope that you've enjoyed this session. Thank you for watching.